Path of Exile 2 has been out for just over 2 weeks, and in those 2 weeks we have seen an insane amount of meta shift within Minion builds, and we're going to continue to see those meta shifts for a while into the future. However, I do believe at this point the Minion meta has settled down just enough that we can start to talk about Minion builds compared to each other and rank them against each other. For this video, I tested out every single Minion using the same gear. I did change passive trees to match different Minion builds, and for a couple of gems I couldn't afford 6 links, but all of that will be accounted for, and I'll tell you when I do have 5 link versus when I do have 6 link for the different builds. The goal of this is to sort of equalize the playing field across different types of Minion builds and compare them against each other to evaluate which one you should play. And at the end of the video, I'm also going to talk about a new Minion build that hasn't really been tested yet, that I'm very excited to test after Christmas, that I think could actually end up being the new wave for Minion builds. I'm also going to talk about a couple of builds created by other creators that have become quite popular, and I'm going to talk about what's good about those builds and what I think is not so good, just like I'm going to do with all of the other Minion builds. So, for starters, let's talk about warriors. Now, warriors are obviously a really crap minion for being your mage damage dealer. Their DPS is very low and they don't have any skills that increase their damage. However, they are ridiculously tanky and absurdly cheap, and as you can see from the gameplay, my warriors are actually stacked right on top of each other while clearing everything. And this is because warriors and any melee minion, in fact any minion period, but this is really good on melee minions, can now be stacked using the new minion teleport tech, where you do your weapon swap to despawn and spawn your minions, allowing your guys to run around on a very tight pile doing crazy damage. And what you're looking at, by the way, for this warrior footage is tier 16 double corrupted map gameplay. And even in the boss dies relatively quickly. And this is just to show you guys how close the different types of minion builds are. We're not talking about a spread where the worst minion builds are like unplayable garbage and the best ones are god tier broken. Rather, what we're looking at is a spread where the bottom end is relatively close to the top end, which means at the end of the day, you should just play what you want to play. Which is why I wanted to start with the weakest minions, which are warriors. Now, up next, I want to talk about brutes. So brutes are actually, in my opinion, the best minion for bossing. This is because they not only are doing very good damage, able to do around 300 to 400k DPS, but they're also essentially unkillable in boss fights. All of the other minions will die during boss fights when certain mechanics go out, but brutes tend to just live and tank through it. This means that whenever you're fighting really hard bosses, brutes actually end up outperforming other minion builds because they just live. Now, if you're just bursting down a boss, killing it really fast, other builds are going to be better, but if you ever just find yourself in a long boss fight that's very difficult, I suggest you try out the brutes to see how they do. They're also able to abuse the new melee stacking mechanic that allows them to do a lot more damage a lot easier. Plus, they get access to corpse explosion for even better clearing, just like most of the minions do, so they're actually pretty decent overall. Up next, I want to talk about the best build I have seen for lightning mages. Darian's prototype build, where you basically stack tons of negative lightning resistance, and then you run Doriani's prototype, I guess is how you say it, in order to apply that negative resistance to monsters around you. Now, one thing I value exceptionally highly in builds that you're going to see as we start progressing through this tier list is that I love minion builds that are good in all forms of content, no matter what mods the mobs have. See, I like to farm tier 16 maps with like 10 modifiers on them, and then those maps I also am doing, you know, breaches and expeditions and all this stuff. So you end up with monsters with like 15 mods on them, which is pretty insane. And what I love about this lightning mage build is that you're replacing enemies' lightning resistance with your lightning resistance, then getting tons of negative lightning resistance. This makes them very consistent while also being very good for bossing. All around, lightning mages are actually pretty solid, but the downsides of this build, the reason why it's not higher up on the tier list is for 2 reasons. One, this build is quite a bit squishier than the other builds, so all of these builds are going to be playing a very similar defensive kit, where we're using alter flesh and armor stacking, block, all this stuff to get insane amounts of damage reduction and crazy amounts of energy shield. Dorian's prototype does not have energy shield on the base, meaning you're losing out on an ES roll on your chest piece. This is made even more important because of the passive Ancient Aegis, which is going to give you 60% more armor and ES from your chest piece, which this build just can't run. The build is also a little bit more vulnerable to lightning damage because it doesn't use lightning resistance, but instead applies its armor to it. Overall, though, a very solid build that is able to clear the hardest content in the game and is very consistent compared to other elemental types because it ignores enemy resistances. Up next, so this is actually, in my opinion, the fourth best Necromancer build. We're going to talk about what used to be the most popular build that I think over time people have started to see less and less value out of, although with one simple change you can actually well over double your boss damage. And that simple change and the build that we're talking about is Arsonist. The simple change with Arsonist is to just stack area damage from your passive tree. I tested this today. I did one boss with it and one boss without it, and my damage literally doubled because they're getting hit by more of the grenades. So your boss damage on Arsonist is now actually competitive with the best of minion builds, able to do close to 500,000 DPS. That is extremely impressive. Arsonists are also fantastic for AoE farming. They're able to obliterate packs of mobs with no problems at all, and they're extremely quick for farming. So how can I be saying so many positive things about Arsonist, but then have them at fourth on the tier list? Why is this? It's because Arsonist is very weak in hard content. If enemies are living more than like 3 or 4 seconds, you're gonna start to see the downside of Arsonist, which is that it's extremely squishy and it has no crowd control. Those two things combined make them very weak when you're doing like what I'm farming, which is, you know, tier 16, 10 mod maps while you're doing expeditions that are adding 5 more mods, right? In that type of content, Arsonists get ripped to pieces. Now, is there a hybrid build where you can combine Arsonists with warriors or something like that to try to have a tankier frontline? Yeah, probably actually. And this is something that needs to be explored more. But in the current metagame, I think Arsonists just straight up are not tanky enough and don't have the CC and survivability to scale into the late game extreme pinnacle content. But if you're farming content that you're stronger than, Arsonists are the fastest farming minion in the game. It's just going to be when you're doing hard content, you're going to start to feel their weaknesses. Up next is a build that has become very popular, and I'm going to talk about the popular new archetype for it that everyone has been talking about, but I'm also going to talk about why that archetype is bad and also why this build is third currently on my tier list. That build is Snipers. Snipers are actually phenomenally strong. I did not expect this at all. Now, I did respec my passive tree for this build to get access to minion accuracy, because I did notice that without that node, my minions were missing quite a bit. But once you get the minion accuracy node, this build absolutely went off. Now, Snipers are one of the minions that I was only able to play with 5 links, yet despite that, you can see me doing close to 500,000 single target damage while missing my 6th link, which would be about a 30% multiplier. That's pretty damn impressive, and the power level of this build is very high. You can see even when mapping, it does very well. Now, why is it that I can look at this build that looks to be potentially the strongest minion build out there, but put it at third? And the answer is simply because I don't believe that there's enough experience and enough knowledge and enough testing with this build to really put it as a top tier build. Now, the thing is, there's a very real possibility it could become one of the best builds, but until I get to play it on a, tier 16 double corruption expedition map where you start to see builds like Arsonist fall off, until then, I'm not convinced that Snipers are the move. Now, there was a very popular build that a lot of people have been talking about that Matt Jestic Multigaming covered, which is they call it the God Slayer sniper build. Now, the problem is, this build is completely impractical. See, PoE 2 is a game where if you die more than once every even if you die once every 10 maps, I would say that build is borderline unplayable. You need a build that's not going to die more than maybe once every 20 or 25 maps, if not even less than that. You need extreme survivability because the punishment for death in this game is extremely high. My problem with this build is that, first of all, instead of running a shield, it's running the Trench Timber, which is going to give you ranks of minion skills, which is insanely strong. The problem is, because you're not running a shield, you're losing out on specifically block and energy shield and armor and max resistance rolls. You can still cap your resistances without a shield, but you're going to be losing out on all of those insane defensive stats, especially the max resistance stat. Now, the other thing that they're doing is, instead of running like a good pair of boots with like movement speed and resistances, max life, like all these fantastic stats, they're instead running the Boots of Ur, which are really strong. They're going to reduce your reservation cost of minions at the cost of your character's 30% slower and significantly less tanky. You combine these two things together, and you can start to see why, you know, even the people who are excited about this build are complaining about dying all the time. It's because these two items they're really good for getting clips of like one-shotting bosses, but the second the boss swings at you, it is over. You are dead. And I think that any minion build playing these two items is going to look ridiculously broken. And that's why I think that this build is not really practical, and I would stick to like a standard defensive kit and then also play snipers. They do plenty of damage in that kit, and you'll be way tankier. Now, we got two more minion builds to cover. The last two are going to be Frost Mages and Reavers. So which build do I think is the best? And then at the end, I've also got a new build that I think is actually really strong that people should start playing. So at number 2, I picked Frost Mages. And the reason for this is because of the new melee tech. See, I think without the melee tech, where you can stack your minions, Frost Mages are actually better than Reavers. And you can see in this video, I was testing out, I forget the name of the support gem, but the one where they can shoot projectiles in an AoE around themselves when they attack, as suggested from the comments. This is a fantastic suggestion. And this version of the build is very strong. It's great for mapping. Now, the problem is it can't use Corpse Explosion, which is a pretty significant downside. These guys also have very slow attack speed. So, yes, Frost Mages do insane damage, and when you couple that with the increased area of effect, similar to what we're doing with Arsonist, their damage goes up quite a bit. It's a significant improvement on the build. They're destroying bosses, they're shredding everything, they're stunning everything, but they just don't quite have that speed that Reavers have. And the other problem is, when you're doing hard content, the second a mob can actually attack or shoots out an AoE or something, all of your mages are going to die, which is really brutal. And this is similar with all the other guys. It's a huge reason why I prefer Reavers. The other thing about Reavers is that Reavers have fantastic support gems. So for casters actually really struggle, specifically like mage minions, struggle to find enough good support gems to really get extra value. So you end up playing like things like extra ranks, but the big thing they have to play is Feeding Frenzy. Feeding Frenzy is going to make your minions take more damage, and the great thing about melee minions, and Reavers are the best for this, is that they can get like 30% damage multiplier support gems, and they don't have to run Feeding Frenzy, which means they not only have more health and more armor than the mages, but they've also got, you know, that 30% damage multiplier that they're not taking. The end result is, you know, if you play with Reavers and you control them well and you use like all the techs that they have, they're going to be like the fastest farming build, even in tight maps. On bosses, they're going to be significantly better because they're tankier, they do so much freaking damage, and everything about Reavers is just sick. But here's the thing that is really interesting. So Reavers actually use a completely different set of support gems than what Frost Mages play. This means that you can theoretically drop a few Reavers, add in Frost Mages, and suddenly you've got a nice little hybrid build that has fantastic CC, which is going to make your monsters a lot tankier. You've got good AoE, you've got range damage, and you still have insane single target and insanely fast kills. You're still able to use Corpse Explosion, and you can see in these clips that actually Frost Mage plus Reaver looks really damn strong. And this is going to need to be a build that I probably cover after Christmas. But we'll see what I end up covering. But I'm really hot right now on Frost Mage Reaver. I think there's a chance that this could be, you know, new best, strongest meta game minion build. And like I said, but we'll see what happens, because the thing is, the meta keeps shifting. We keep figuring out new techs. A week ago, melee minions were unplayable. Now we can stack melee minions and just make them absolutely insane. Who knows what we're going to figure out in 2 weeks, right? But for now, this is what I think that the meta game is for minions, and I hope this was helpful in helping you choose what build to play. And that's all I got for today. I'm Roost Cruise. I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.